More simply, though, I think what we need to rediscover is love. That my life isn't about me. My duty, to the extent I can reasonably discharge it, is to try and love other people. And I don't love them by killing them. I don't love them by discarding them. I don't love them by ignoring them.
Hi, I'm Glenn from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. We're in a series called The Way Back. Can we light a path back to Christian faith from the post-Christian West? We certainly think so, and our guests, like Professor John Keown, are going to help us light that path. Professor Keown is a bioethicist, one of the world's leading ethicists. He's Professor of Ethics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He's also a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, and he is going to talk with me about life, when it begins, when it ends, what its purpose is, and the sort of society we want to be if we want to affirm and uphold the dignity and the worth of each and every human being. How can we have an ethic of love when actually an ethic of choice might be at odds with that ethic of love? We get into all that. It's a fascinating conversation. I begin by asking Professor Keown for his credentials.
I graduated in law at Cambridge and then taught medical law at Leicester, and then later at Cambridge. And for the last 20 years, I've been in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown, which is one of the world's most prestigious centers for research into bioethical issues. So I approach these issues first and foremost as a medical lawyer.
Right. So it would be very good as a lawyer to define terms. So when we're speaking about euthanasia, what are we speaking about, and how would you sort of differentiate that from assisted dying?
Well, terminology is very important, isn't it? It's important to know what we're talking about. So many people are confused and misled by misleading terminology. One problem is that there's no universally agreed definition of euthanasia or assisted dying. Probably the most useful definition is, in terms of euthanasia, is where a doctor intentionally ends the life of a patient because the doctor thinks the patient's better off dead, typically because the patient is suffering greatly. So euthanasia is basically mercy killing, if you like. That's a simple summary of what it involves. The intentional termination of life because it's thought that the patient would be better off dead. And then we can subdivide that into voluntary euthanasia, where the patient has requested it, non-voluntary euthanasia, where the patient is incapable of requesting it. Perhaps the patient is an infant or someone with advanced dementia. And then involuntary euthanasia, where a competent patient does not want to be killed, but nevertheless the doctor ends the patient's life. So that's how I define euthanasia. We can contrast that slightly with physician-assisted suicide, where the doctor doesn't kill the patient. The doctor provides the patient with the means to kill themselves, typically by prescribing a lethal drug, which the patient then later ingests. The third phrase, assisted dying, I find very unhelpful, very misleading, and very confusing. So I don't like using it, and I don't think anyone should use it, partly because it's so vague. People often use it to mean euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Other people use it to mean just physician-assisted suicide, and still other people think it includes palliative care at the end of life. So it's a hopelessly vague phrase, and I think it should be abolished.
What do you say to the argument that I believe it was in 1962 in the UK that suicide itself was decriminalized? Does that not then mean that somebody assisting someone in suicide should be allowed to do so? If the taking of one's own life is at least decriminalized, surely helping them to do something that is not a crime should not be a crime either. Is there a link?
One hears that argument. It's not uncommon, but it's fallacious. In 1961, Parliament decriminalised suicide by the Suicide Act, but it maintained the prohibition on assisting or encouraging suicide. And the government made it quite clear that in decriminalizing suicide, it was not its intention to condone suicide or to create a right to suicide. The government minister said it was not the government's intention to condone what he called self-murder. And in the later case of Diane Pretty, the very eminent jurist Lord Bingham made it quite clear that suicide was decriminalized not to approve suicide, but for other reasons, or a host of other reasons why it was decriminalized. Partly because I think people realized the law was counterproductive. It wasn't the appropriate way of trying to deal with the social problem of suicide. That calls for greater help, support and understanding of those poor people who feel sufficiently depressed or pressured to take their own lives. So it was a humane, if you like, relaxation of the law in order to help, as it were, people not to commit suicide. It wasn't decriminalized in order to help people to commit suicide.
Now, you have written extensively on this issue and debated many people on these topics. I'm going to ask you to put yourself into the shoes of someone on the other side of things. Mm-hmm. And can I ask you to sort of outline what do you think are some of the best legal and intellectual arguments for euthanasia? And then I'll ask you, what are some of the most emotionally powerful arguments that you've heard? Because they might not be always the same thing.
Well, I think the two main arguments that advocates of legalization use are respect for individual autonomy and duty to alleviate suffering. So the first argument is, look, hey, it's my life. It's a very important decision when and how I die, and I should be the one who makes it. So if I can refuse medical treatment, which many people accept I can, then I should be able to request a lethal injection or a prescription for lethal drugs. Sort of my life, my choice. That's probably the foremost argument used. And allied to that is, don't we as a society, and doesn't the medical profession in particular, have an important duty to end suffering? And there are certain cases where patients sadly do die in pain and distress. And if they want a lethal injection, why not? So I think those are the two big arguments in favor. And they're serious arguments. Many reasonable people are persuaded by them, and they've got to be taken seriously. So there are weaker arguments such as, well, opinion polls show a majority of people in favor, and also there's no difference between intending to kill and foreseeing death. But I think those aren't as strong as the two main ones: autonomy and beneficence. Okay.
Well, before we get into the emotional weight that often carries such dialogues and debates. How do you oppose the autonomy point? Because we are a society of autonomous individuals. We believe in expressive individualism. My body, my choice. My life, my choice is just such an unquestioned slogan. It can be hard to sort of get underneath and undermine that or counter that. So how do you attempt to do that?
Well, I'd start by questioning whether the argument's valid. I mean, do we really believe my body, my choice? In some respects we do, but in some respects we don't. If we really believed that, we'd have no problem with legalizing hard drugs tomorrow. If it's my body and I want to take heroin, why shouldn't I be able to do it? If it's my body and I want to be killed and eaten by somebody, well, why shouldn't I be able to do that? So if we want to stage gladiatorial games where you and I fight to the death, Glenn,
if it was all consensual.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I think when one raises questions like this, it soon becomes apparent that autonomy isn't a moral absolute. I think autonomy is a very important capacity. I mean, it's something that we have as human beings, and most creatures in the world don't have the ability to make informed, rational choices, our free will, our moral agency. It's an enormously important capacity that we have. But it brings with it, if you like, a responsibility to use it responsibly. We ought to make responsible and sound choices, choices that are actually going to serve our well-being and the well-being of others. And decisions to destroy ourselves are not sound decisions. They're counterproductive, if you like. They go against the basic good that is human life. So I would say that, yes, autonomy is important, but we've got to properly understand that autonomy should be a good servant rather than a bad master. We ought to make choices that are good, that are going to promote human flourishing, and avoid choices that are going to be destructive or self-destructive.
And at that point, we're overlapping quite significantly with a whole area of philosophical and theological discussion. So my ears sort of prick up at what you're saying, and I'm reminded of St. Augustine. I'm reminded of someone whose kind of doctrine of the freedom of the will is that you cannot choose the bad, but to choose the bad is not a good in and of itself, but that we are free to the degree that we choose the good, which I don't know, like, is there an intellectual tradition that your arguments kind of fit within, that has a sort of grandfathered by Augustine, or I guess what I'm getting at is it can be difficult to have these conversations in a purely secular way. Do you agree, or do you think that you can sort of make these natural law arguments purely from a secular point of view?
Absolutely. So the arguments I use in my work are not theological. They're philosophical. They're drawn from this great natural law tradition to which some of the greatest Christian thinkers have of course contributed. So it's a mistake to think that just because someone's a Christian thinker, we can dismiss them because they're imposing their morality on other people. No, sound morality and sound theology can walk hand in hand. Faith and reason are complementary, not antagonistic. And I think much of what comes out of that great natural law philosophical tradition, which is probably the dominant philosophical tradition of Western civilization, going right back to Aristotle, is so important and needs to be, as it were, rediscovered by many people who have not been taught it in schools and colleges. So people today have a very superficial understanding of ethics and particularly of autonomy.
Yes. And I think one of the ways that people can wake up to the anemic vision they have for freedom is in these very discussions, isn't it? That as soon as you ask the question, well, can I volunteer for the gladiatorial games? Or should I let my friend completely throw their life away on drugs? And at that point, our slogans about my body, my choice kind of run into reality and run into moral intuitions that go quite a bit deeper. So I think that's very helpful. What about that second line of argument in terms of the alleviation of pain? It's the compassion argument, really, isn't it? And that can be forwarded very, very, very powerfully, especially when stories are told, and stories are told of ongoing chronic pain that seems to have no end to it. Surely it is a mercy. Surely it is compassionate to kill in that instance. What do you say to that?
I'd say compassion is an important, if you like, feeling to have towards each other, especially those who are suffering. And people suffer in all sorts of ways, of course, not just physical pain, but emotional pain, loneliness. So we should, as it were, suffer with, which is what compassion means, our brothers and sisters who are in difficulties, whether it's physical or mental or emotional pain. But I think compassion by itself isn't a moral principle, because compassion doesn't really tell us what the right way to respond to someone's suffering is. Compassion can, and emotion can, mislead us into doing deeply immoral things. So I think while compassion is a good sense, if you like, a good disposition to have, we need the intellect and a sound morality to guide us into how best to respond to somebody's suffering. Because, as I say, compassion can by itself lead to all sorts of gravely immoral conduct. And also, we're living in an age, never before in the history of humanity have carers, particularly our remarkable palliative care doctors and nurses, been able to do so much for so many people. So it's peculiar that this is precisely the time in our history when people are pushing to change the law to allow doctors to kill patients, when I think it's broadly accepted that palliative care is more than able to address the vast majority of suffering that people feel. And even in those very small cases where the suffering is refractory, it's possible to render the patient unconscious so that they're not aware of the pain. And following on from that, Glenn, I think although the stories we are constantly bombarded with by the mass media, which is broadly supportive of legalization, I think it's fair to say, these heartbreaking stories like Diane Pretty, like Tony Nicholson, etc., I think it's important to realize that not only can proper palliative care help these people, so, for example, people with Diane's condition, motor neuron disease, say, I'm going to choke to death. Well, under proper palliative care, you're not going to choke to death. So there's a great deal of misinformation out there. So we can, I think, alleviate a great deal of physical pain and suffering. But that's not, when you look at countries where they've relaxed the law, look at the United States where I live. The jurisdictions that have relaxed the law, when they ask the patients, why is it you want physician-assisted suicide? Pain or fear of pain is actually way down the list. The biggest two reasons are, number one, loss of autonomy, and two, a decreasing ability to engage in activities making life enjoyable. So the reality is that it's not pain and suffering. In the vast majority of cases, it's what you might call existential suffering, that I just don't like the quality of life I'm leading now. I can't do the gardening, or I can't ride my bike, or whatever it might be. So while not wanting to minimize, the limitations that sickness can place on us, especially at the end of life, I think it's important to reframe the debate. Much is made of agonizing deaths, but those aren't the reasons that people are seeking physician-assisted suicide in states like Oregon or countries like Canada or the Netherlands.
Right, right. And those who discuss the reasons for considering taking their own lives, very, very often they mention things like being a burden and not wanting to be a burden on others, which again, in a society that is so much about autonomy, we become these atomized individuals, and I think we were kind of made to be burdens in one sense. So we were made to certainly rely on each other and to be interdependent, and certainly with the death of family members, you recognize that someone is not a single individual making a choice, but they were made to rely on one another, wouldn't you say?
Yes, and I think we are. We have duties to one another, and I think in the modern world, we're forgetting that. We're not caring adequately for the elderly, for the sick, for those with disabilities. And so it's not surprising that a number of these people think, well, I'd rather be dead, than abandoned. And another point I think that comes into this is that the notion of an autonomous choice, often our choices reflect our perception of how we're valued or disvalued by other people. So your point that you rightly raise about feeling a burden, which is fairly common in the States. It's a fairly common reason for people to cite for seeking physician-assisted suicide, I think reflects the fact that we regard many of these people as burdensome. We live in a society which values youth, beauty, productivity. So where does that leave people with physical and intellectual disabilities? Where does this leave the frail elderly? They are regarded as a burden by society. And no wonder they feel a burden,
right,
because that's what we're telling them.
Right.
And once we make available this very easy, cheap, quick exit, I'm convinced many, many more of them will avail themselves of it. It will further change the culture in this deplorable way where we see our dependent brothers and sisters as useless burdens.
Yes. And there's often a dynamic that happens where the person putting euthanasia forwards is usually, but perhaps they've just had a terminal diagnosis or something. But they're very much compos mentis. They're very much an individual who's used to exercising their autonomy. And they can be very persuasive in the points that they make. But I guess if physician-assisted suicide was made legal tomorrow, it doesn't just change life for that individual. It changes life for everyone. Can you kind of give us a sense of if physician-assisted suicide is made legal tomorrow, how does that change the medical profession's kind of outlook and how they can proceed, and how does it affect society more broadly?
I think it's a great question. It follows on nicely from your previous point about people feeling a burden. I think legalization would mark a profound cultural shift, both for the medical and nursing professions and for the law and for society. So let's start by reminding the audience that this prohibition on killing each other or intentionally helping each other to kill themselves would go against the historic principle of the sanctity of life, which values the life of each and every individual. We're all regarded as fundamentally equal. No one is regarded as being better off dead. It's an incredibly important principle, Glenn, that is often overlooked in this debate. So a very important committee of the House of Lords that looked into this whole question in 1993-94 opposed legalization because it said the prohibition on intentional killing is the cornerstone of law and of social relationships. It protects each one of us impartially, embodying the belief that we are all equal. And I think that's almost worth repeating 2 or 3 times. It's such a foundational principle that the law and medical ethics before the law, if you like, going back to Hippocrates, who ruled out physician-assisted suicide. It's an insight, it's a recognition of our intrinsic worth, however sick, however disabled. And if the law changes that, then it sweeps away that principle and we move into a new paradigm where the law and the medical profession and society say, well, actually, no, some people would be better off dead. And we'll start perhaps with the terminally ill, however you define them, and it's a vague concept to begin with. And then we'll say, well, hang on, why only the terminally ill? Here's somebody over here, they're not going to die in the next 6 months. They've got maybe 30 or 40 years to live, but they've got very, very painful arthritis. So let's include them. And then you've got people who are desperately, chronically ill in other ways, or who are mentally ill. And we'll say, yes, well, mental suffering can be just as severe as chronic physical suffering, so let's include them as well. And then what about all these lonely old people? We have an epidemic of loneliness in the West. What about the old person who says, I have no friends? I see no point in carrying on. And this is not scaremongering. This has happened in the Netherlands, with the first country to legalize euthanasia back in 1984, not 2002, as many people say. They started with, well, we want to really just help those who are suffering in agony at the end of life, very severe physical symptoms. And then they extended it to people with mental illness, mental distress. And only a few years ago, the then Dutch government said, well, look, there are lots of old people, not necessarily anything wrong with their health, but they think they're tired of life. So we think the law should be extended to allow them to get a lethal prescription. So you see, the paradigm shift may not initially seem very pronounced, but it is. It's an utterly dramatic foundational shift. And that's why I think it's wrong to see these bills, which are constantly being introduced into parliaments in the British Isles, as just small, modest changes in the law. They're foundational.
Yes. Yes, and you make a great case elsewhere, and we'll point to your work in the description, and you can give a plug at the end. But you point elsewhere to there's a logical necessity to the slippery slope, as well as empirical evidence that it's happened in places like the Netherlands where they've tried it. But the logical necessity of it is that whatever safeguards you begin with, they're not sort of inherent to the autonomy point. If the reason you're granting somebody's wish to die is actually their personal autonomy, you can put all the safeguards you like around it in terms of, well, they must be, it must be unbearable suffering, they must be terminal, etc., etc. But that is not inherent to the reason why you've granted it. And as soon as you've granted it, you've granted it in principle in every case.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought us on to that point, because there's two things I'd like to say. The first one, and this follows on from the last point about what a radical change the law would effect if it were relaxed. I think people need to realize, despite all the talk about autonomy, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide aren't really about autonomy fundamentally, because somebody else is being asked, the doctor is being asked to give the patient the lethal injection or to write the lethal prescription. The doctor's involved, and if society is endorsing that judgment, then society is involved. We are saying to people, however we categorize them, let's go back, say, to the terminally ill, we are saying, yes, we think that in this situation, you would be better off dead. It's not just your judgment, it's our judgment.
Okay, yes.
So it's society making a judgment that you'd be better off dead. So I think it's a misrepresentation to say this is all about my choice. Well, to an extent it is. You're asking for it. But, as I say in the book, the patient proposes, but the doctor disposes. The doctor is saying, yes, I agree. I am judging that you would be better off dead. And if the doctor can decide that in relation to a terminally ill patient, well, why not a whole host of other kinds of patients as well? And then bringing me on to the slippery slope arguments, which I think are neglected but very, very powerful. There are two. So there's one slippery slope argument, the one that most people focus on, about, well, could you have sufficiently strict safeguards to prevent mistake or abuse in individual cases? I think that's a very important argument, and we shouldn't neglect it. I don't think any jurisdiction that has relaxed its law has got anything approaching effective safeguards. They largely leave it to the doctors involved, who then self-report perhaps to somebody which has, a minimal role in supervising and enforcing the law. So the practical safeguards don't work, in my view. They're not effective. But I think what people really need to take away is what you said. What's the principle undergirding this new law? If we're going to change the law to allow the terminally ill to get lethal prescriptions or lethal injections, it's because we respect their choice. We're going to grant their choice, and we think they'd be better off dead because they're physically suffering. Okay. If those are your principles, then you can't sensibly limit the law to physician-assisted suicide for the terminally ill. Because if you do that, what about the autonomy of the chronically ill? They might want a lethal prescription as well, and they may say we're going to be suffering for longer than the terminally ill person. So your principles will just propel you down this slope. You'll have to say, you know what? Yeah, we need to go further. Otherwise, we're discriminating unfairly against this whole tranche of other people who want a lethal prescription or lethal injection. And then it goes further to those who aren't able to make a request. Because if we think certain people are better off dead because, say, they're physically suffering, well, there are an awful lot of people who are physically suffering who cannot make a request for death. There are lots of infants who are physically suffering, lots of demented people who are physically suffering. Why deny them the merciful release, if you like, from their suffering that we're giving to all these people who ask for it? Now, of course, when you run that argument, the logical argument, often you get the response, yeah, but they're not autonomous. They're not making a request. And the counter-argument is, well, so what? You've got two arguments for changing the law. One is autonomy. The other is relief of suffering. But if there's no autonomy in play, you're still left with your duty to alleviate suffering. So whether you realize it or not when you start on this slope, you are logically committed to ending the suffering of people who can't request it, whether disabled babies or people with dementia. And what many of your listeners may not know is when you read the literature on this subject, there's a vast literature, I think it's fair to say the vast majority of philosophers who are in favor of euthanasia or assisted suicide are in favor of euthanasia for those who can request it and for those who can't request it. So famous utilitarians like Peter Singer very honestly is in favor of voluntary euthanasia and non-voluntary euthanasia as well.
Yes. Yes. And I think you very well make the point that kind of slippery slope is not scaremongering. A, it's happening, but B, it's implicit to the arguments that are being made. And I think you've touched on another thing that is just so rampant in our culture, not simply that point about autonomy and the expressive individualism and the valorization of choice, but the denial that you can meaningfully suffer, or that suffering must be eliminated at all costs. And of course, if suffering must be eliminated at all costs, then I guess the sufferer must be eliminated at all costs, which is an incredibly dystopian vision. John, we've presumed on your time quite a lot. You've been very generous with it. Thank you so much. We're a Christian ministry, and we speak to people about life and death and meaning and purpose and everything. It seems to me like as we talk about this issue, it might feel like an issue that just sort of rolls around every time someone wants to propose a bill in the House of Commons. But actually, we've actually pointed to some of the fundamental aspects of what it is to be a human being, what meaning is about, the place of compassion, choice, suffering. What do you think we need to learn as a society in order to make your position and my position against euthanasia existentially satisfying and for it to make sense? Because it feels like we can say no to this thing, but it needs to fit into a much larger vision for who we are, how we belong, and what the meaningful life is. So preach to me about what that vision is.
Well, how long have we got? Well, in brief, I think we need to rediscover our great Western moral tradition. And the moral debates in the modern age are so utterly superficial and are reduced to what I want and what I want to get, and I want it now. It's about me. I think we need to rediscover that, no, we are moral agents. We need to have a sound morality, that the sound morality isn't selfishness. And one can look at many great philosophical traditions and the thought of many great religions. It's not about me. It's not about what I want. We should be asking, what ought I to want? And I think more reflective people realize that we really need to think beyond our passions, our desires, our feelings. We need to have a rational, sound basis for choosing and choosing what is right. So that's one kind of, if you like, intellectual dimension. We need to, as it were, reconnect with this great Western moral tradition, not only philosophical but theological as well, and they are, as I mentioned earlier, totally compatible with each other. It's a wonderfully vast and rich intellectual tradition. In a way, more simply, though, I think what we need to rediscover is love. That my life isn't about me. My duty, to the extent I can reasonably discharge it, is to try and love other people. And I don't love them by killing them. I don't love them by discarding them. I don't love them by ignoring them. I think that the disability community is really helping us here in the modern age to see that, they've been abandoned historically. They've been neglected and still are to a great degree. But now as a political force, I think they are bringing to the attention of the community the importance of caring for each other. And so I think That's what I would say. Intellectually, really rediscover our Western moral tradition, and personally and as a community, focus on the most vulnerable. That's what defines what kind of a community we are.
Yes. Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. Love trumping this sort of pure liberty that is quite the myth, really, that we've swallowed, really. And that is a much more compelling vision. Thank you. Now, John, if people want to catch up with your work and read further or listen further about what you have to say, where can they go?
Well, I would recommend, firstly, that I have a copy here to hand as it happens. Euthanasia, Ethics and Public Policy, 2nd edition, Cambridge University Press, 2018. So that's my big academic tome, if you like, on the arguments for and against euthanasia. But its focus is what's happened in those countries that have relaxed their law, particularly the Netherlands. So I've been looking at the Dutch experience for over 30 years now, and it shows just what happens once you change the law. The slippery slope, both practical and logical. So that's a kind of a scholarly book. A much more accessible book would be the little book Debating Euthanasia, published by Hart in 2012, in which the first half, a leading advocate of legalization, Professor Emily Jackson at the LSE, writes in favour of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and in the second half, I put the arguments against. So I think, in terms of euthanasia, those are the two things I would draw people's attention to. But also, if they want to go on the website of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, they can click on my photograph, and it will have my entire CV there with all my articles, all my publications, many of which are fairly freely available. And if anybody would like to, email me, my email's on the website, and has any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer them.
That's wonderful. So that's the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and we'll put the links in the description. Professor John Keown, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Glenn.